Hey everybody, I'm Amanda with DevExpress and welcome to today's webinar, The Fastest Way to Your Next Test, TestCafe plus TestCafe Studio, presented by DevExpress Technical Evangelist Paul Usher. In this session, Paul will demonstrate the difference between TestCafe and TestCafe Studio. He'll show you how to write code-based tests more quickly, and he'll explore the power of TestCafe Studio's integrated visual test recorder for those who don't want to manually write test code. Topics today will be how to create and debug tests in TestCafe Studio without writing any code, how to create stable selectors for your tests, the advantages of TestCafe's smart assertion mechanism, and how to leverage both TestCafe and TestCafe Studio within your organization. This session is being recorded and it will be made available on our DevExpress YouTube channel later today, and we will also send you a link to the recording in a follow-up email. We will also do a live Q&A at the end of this presentation. Just type your questions in the GoToWebinar control panel at any time throughout the broadcast. We do have members of the dev team online with us, so they will try and get to all of your questions as best they can. All right, thank you so much for joining us. I will now hand things over to Paul.
Thank you, Amanda, and good morning, everyone. Now, today's presentation builds on our recent end-to-end testing webinar, where we looked at the power and flexibility of TestCafe open source. We're going to focus on TestCafe Studio. But before I get started, I want to address a couple of questions. First of all, what is end-to-end testing and why are tests important? Well, we can test business scenarios, including the whole flow of your application from start to finish, including all of the moving parts, whether that's accessing APIs, database work, or integrated pieces. And it simulates exactly how the user will interact with the UI elements, the different conditions and the appearances across multiple platforms and browsers. And end-to-end tests allow you to go further than traditional unit tests, which of course is still important, but they cover the pieces and not the whole. Functional tests operate across that bigger picture, and they're typically slower to write and more resource intensive. If we take a look at this testing pyramid, we can see the majority of tests are at the bottom, but they're the ones that are quick to implement. And as we get to the top, we can see where end-to-end tests sit. Now, while they can be more costly, they're still critical to the success of your application. And TestCafe aims at reducing the effort of creating these tests. The next question then, how does TestCafe open source differ from TestCafe Studio? Well, before I continue, I want to point out that instead of repeating TestCafe open source, I'm now just going to use the word TestCafe. And that's going to refer to the open source engine. And then I'll call TestCafe Studio either by its full name or just by Studio. First, a quick recap on what TestCafe is all about. Now, in short, it's a modern approach to perform end-to-end testing in a smoother way. It's a Node.js CLI or command line interface tool. Specifically, it doesn't require any type of WebDriver or plugin to use in your browsers. It allows you to automate tasks in the browser and emulate those user actions. And of course, it's provided open source. Whereas TestCafe Studio actually has the open source version under the hood. So it offers all of its capabilities plus extras. And we can see from this comparison list where those products separate. And in fact, that bottom section, I'm going to call out as specific benefits. So let's take a look at those. Some of the key benefits lay in this simple to use interface that is being provided. You've got the visual test recorder, which allows you to record all of your actions, be it clicks, typing, key presses, iframe interaction, and even things like file upload and browser dialog manipulation. You've got the property grid, which helps you create assertions, lets you view and modify element characteristics, allows you to look at different evaluation options, and even recalculate the values in real time. You've got the element picker, which highlights different target elements on your page. The selector generation with prioritization and the ability to add custom attributes. Easy to use action panel. You've got access to the run configuration, the test explorer, and access to the visual report log and screenshots. Now don't forget also that TestCafe can be used as a test runner for any file that you generate within TestCafe Studio. And that's particularly important if you're wanting to automate your tests with continuous integration. Now to get some ideas on how TestCafe Studio works, what we'll do is jump over to it and take a look. We can see straight away that we've got a modern IDE style user interface. We've got a menu bar, we've got a toolbar, we've got access to quick features we might want, such as the browser that I want to record a test in or the run configuration I want to apply. I've got my test explorer on the left, quick access to recording a new test or creating a new fixture, and then my report panel at the bottom of the page. And then in the center, we've got the multiple document interface where we're going to be able to see and work with our tests. Of course, these panels can be resized or minimized out of the way to give us maximum real estate as we move through. Before I go into the different details on each of these aspects, I wanted to show you how easy it is to get started with TestCafe Studio and actually start recording your application testing. So what I'm going to do here is paste in our example URL and then hit the big red button to start recording a test. The browser that's going to be running today is Google Chrome. And if you drop down the list of browser options here, it will simply show you the browsers available to your system at the time. I'll be going into each configuration in more detail as we move through. I'm going to choose to start recording a test, and we can see that TestCafe has opened up the browser window, and it's now waiting for my user interaction. So I'm going to start by confirming my click, and then I'll just type in the name, select a couple of options. One of the nice things with this example page is it introduces text boxes, text areas, button clicks, combo boxes, radio buttons, drag elements. So there's a lot to actually play around with. I'm going to choose my primary operating system. Because this slide is not available until I've interacted with this checkbox, I'll select that and drag. If I switch back to TestCafe Studio, we're going to see that every one of those actions that I performed is captured in this interactive editor. And in fact, if I was to click on any one of those actions, we can see how the CSS selector was selected, and we can see where there's other attributes such as text that was brought in. And of course I can interact with that, and again as we move through we're looking to a little more detail. At this point I can press stop. Effectively I've just tested some visual elements on my page, and now I want to see what happens when I run that test back. I'm just using the vanilla Chrome runner at the moment just to get through seeing what is actually happening behind the scenes. Again, the browser pops up. It's going to load my page, and each of the items that I performed, you could see very quickly ran back through. And now in my reports on my results window, I've got a test that was successful. I can drill into that test. It's going to show me the browser that I used. It's going to show me that it passed, duration. If there'd been screenshots, it would be able to be clicked on here. The results themselves can be presented in a grid or a number of the other formats that we provide out of the box. If you're wanting to take in the same results as a JSON package, it's available. Now there are also other third-party formats available. that you can install via the Node Package Manager or NPM. So we can see we've got easy access to results from tests that we ran, and obviously if there were multiple tests, they'd show here. I can jump back to my test by navigating straight from that test result. Before we get too far ahead, let's take a look then at some of the settings behind run configuration, because it becomes really quite powerful when it comes to different options and how I can present my tests. We can see that by default we've got a setup for each of the browsers represented. Now, anytime you see the word headless, it's actually referring to the fact that the browser is going to be running in a non-UI mode, which is typically what would happen in that continuous integration scenario. You can also see that we've got a configuration here called All, and that's because TestCafe allows you to run tests in parallel, so you can run them across multiple installed browsers and even remote browsers. I want to start looking at the options that we set inside Chrome. Just one browser selected. We've set the default report view to grid, but as you saw, I can switch that in between when I'm looking at those results. And in recent updates, we've added some new features to this configuration dialog. In particular, the options we can see inside browser options. So we've got the CLI flags, so command line interface or runtime parameters, and emulated device. If I wanted to create a new configuration, I'd hit the blue button here and fill in the details. But I've taken the liberty of doing some of that a little earlier. And I've called this one Chrome Full Screen. So again, still selecting my Chrome browser. But what I've done is use the parameters provided by Chrome to actually start the browser as a full screen view. I've also gone through and then created another version called Chrome iPhone 10. And this time I'm actually setting it up to emulate a device. So inside Chrome is you've got your developer tools. You can put it into this responsive design and use different emulations, which can be useful when you're testing a responsive design site. So before I go through too much more on that one, I want to see what happens when I run that same test as Chrome full screen and then as the iPhone 10. It's a nice simple quick test to load up. So let's see what happens when we get into it. The test run is running and we can see straight away that we are in full screen. So that's handy. We can see we're going to be able to maybe check for specific things with the browser in full screen. By simply changing the run configuration here, I now want to run it as an emulated iPhone 10. Now this particular page doesn't have anything special when running it in a smaller or an emulated view, but what you will see is how the browser, when it's run, changes and switches into that emulated mode. Moving back into that configuration panel, let's take a look at some of the other options we've got available. Inside our test failure debugging panel, we can actually have the test fail if there's a JavaScript error. And typically this might be if you're using a third-party library that's hosted on CDN and something's changed, your site may break and therefore your tests are going to break the minute that happens. So that's handy to actually say if anything happens in the console that shouldn't, I want the actual test to fail. I can also come through and say skip any uncaught server errors. So if there's something happening with a promise and it's rejected or something happens with a server call, we can actually say whether we want the test to fail or continue. The next option here is to automatically take a screenshot when a test fails. So instead of you having to add an action during that process for that, TestCafe Studio can take a screenshot automatically. We've then got debug mode, which will mean when you're running your test, it will pause on the first action or assertion and allow you to step through. And we're going to look at that in a little more detail soon. Quarantine mode is an interesting one. in essence means that if you're running some non-deterministic test that may fail, may pass, it will then base it on either a collective set of passes versus the collective set of fails. And if you've actually got a test where the result differs between test runs, it's going to be flagged as unstable, which can be useful finding some of those pesky scenarios that otherwise may be difficult to track. We've got the ability to pause a test when it fails, or even stop the entire test run if a test fails. And finally, we can stop the browser from caching any page content, which can also interfere with tests over different times. Moving into the advanced options, we've actually got the ability to specify the reports path, and we've also got the ability to specify the screenshot path. Importantly, under here are our selector, assertion, and page load timeout values. Again, I'll be covering what the timeouts do and how that's such an integral part of TestCafe, but for each individual configuration, you can actually specify those values here. You've got the ability to change the playback speed, ranging from 1 being 100% speed. It may be that you're going through some complex scenarios and want to actually see that test slow down and step through it. And then there's a concurrency option, which works when you're running multiple browser instances as they work in parallel, and since each runs its own portion of tests, you can minimize the time required for running those multiple tests. Remembering that everything I'm showing you here is available to TestCafe open source, but as parameters that you pass in, you can start to see that there's a nice, easy way to gain access to those different configurations and obviously apply them very quickly when running your tests. Let's step back a second and take a look at the Explorer window. We can see that I created a test by just using the welcome screen and starting the record a test straight away, and that created this entry. Now the webinar example is a folder, so TestCafe is pointed to an actual test directory, and then it will look for other directories and files inside there. The file types we're interested in are .testcafe, which is the visual recorded tests, or we could be working with plain old JavaScript or TypeScript files, and we can record tests into those as well. As far as the .testcafe file goes, we can see that the first item in here is what we call a fixture. Now, a fixture is a collection of tests, and typically we would have one fixture per file. If I double click on the fixture, we can see that in the editor, it's going to show me a list of any tests inside the fixture to which I could run them or remove them. I could run all of the tests, or I could record a new test from here. If I want to change the settings of the fixture, I'm going to invoke the fixture properties dialog, and I can actually come through and give it a new name. We'll be pretty original and call it Paul Test. We can see that the file name gets updated. At this point, I could update the web page if I wanted to. And if I need to implement basic HTTP or NTLM authentication, I can put the credentials in that panel at that point. From here, I could click on a test and it will take me into the test file, which is the same as double clicking inside the Explorer window here. And we're back to seeing the visual test that I created. From here, I can physically open the tested page so I can interact with it, or I can go back and view the fixture. The record button in this instance allows me to continue recording or pick up where I left off and record more test actions. More on that in just a minute. I could run the test. I can move to the before each or after each hooks. I went into that in quite a lot of detail in the previous webinar. I can convert this individual test, or in fact at a fixture level, I could convert all of my tests to JavaScript, and there's a lot of benefits in there which we'll cover. Or of course I can remove elements from my test. What I want to do now is just spend a couple of minutes looking at the panels on the right and talk about how they work with the visual test and the test editor. When we're working with a web page, we've got essential actions. We've got things like click, double click, typing text, pressing keys, actions that users perform when working with a page. And we call these on-page actions. We can see the panel here. We have a bunch of them. Now the recorder itself does a fantastic job of recording almost all of them. In fact, there's only 3 that we are not able to capture, and that's drag to element, wait, and hover. Those 3 actions are available, as are all the others, directly from the on-page action. So if I wanted to drag to an element, I could simply come to this panel, click, it's going to be inserted, and the properties become available to where I can select the selector and then work with what I want to do. So I'm going to have obviously a source selector, a destination selector being a drag method. The same goes for any of the on-page actions. I can manually come through and I can click and bring them into my test. And if, for example, I'd done something like spelt the developer name wrong, I can jump in and just tweak that information inside the properties panel. Now the recorder can even do such things as determine when I've moved between frames. So if I've got a window with an iframe, the recorder is going to pick up that I actually switched to the iframe. Again, available manually inside the panel. There are also some other parts that are related to the browser itself, and these are browser actions, and that's control over things like native dialogues, screenshots, whether you're resizing the browser window or navigating to any other page, even on a different domain. All the browser actions are available directly in the browser actions panel. There's also the debug panel, and this is quite useful. We've already covered the fact that inside run configuration, I can turn on the debug mode, which is going to stop the test on the very first action, and then I can step through it. But what I can do here is I could actually add a debug element, and I can place it anywhere I want in my test. And when I play that test back, TestCafe is going to pause at that point and allow me to step through and see what's going on. So I could actually have a rather large test and end up with a few debug elements in there, or actions, and also the same with the speed. So we said that we could alter the entire test and have a playback speed of whatever we want. But in this instance, it could be that I want my playback speed to be slow leading up to that debug. And then I can add another playback speed later on and take it back to my 100%. Let's see what happens in the browser now that I've got that debug statement in there. Let's make sure we step back on Chrome, and then I'll run the test. Browser window appears. And we can now see at the lower of the screen, I'm debugging the test. Now, because TestCafe locks the page while it's running the test, which means that you can't accidentally interrupt the test or set something off, the page is locked. So if I want to do anything inside there, I could use this unlock feature. And as soon as I click that, it then means that all of the elements are now available. I can use the developer tools to jump in and play around with what I want. The other option I have is to resume my entire test, or I can actually just step forward to the next action, whether that's a page interaction or whether that's an assertion. I'm just going to choose resume. It'll finish the test and off I can go. There's a couple of other sections in this panel. We've got statements. Now the element selector allows you to create a commonly used element and reuse it. So you're not having to go in and find that selector each time. And then you've got the define function, which allows you to actually implement a client function that's going to be executed on the client side. So something directly in the browser. You can then check its result in an assertion. It could be, for example, you want to do a page redirect and then make sure that the URL is actually the page that you were taken to. Custom scripts allow you to inject part of TestCafe script code into a recorded test outside the scope of today, so I'm not going to get into that in too much detail. What I am interested in now is assertions, because assertions really are the lifeline of running live tests. And the TestCafe provides quite a number of them. Traditionally, you'd probably use equal and okay, or not equal and not okay, more than anything else. But we also have contains and not contains. We can check the type of an object or not the type of an object. We've got greater, greater, equal, less, or less than or equal to, a within, and a match, not match. But typically, if you were looking at, say, an assertion against a text property, you might use contains or not contains. Whereas if you're looking to check the element size or coordinates of something on screen, then you'd be looking probably to use something like the greater than, less than, or within type element values. One of the most powerful features of TestCafe Studio, or TestCafe in general really, but is the built-in auto-weighting functionality and the smart assertion mechanism. And what we're going to do is actually look at a test which is called auto-weighting. If we look at the fixture, it's going to open up a demo on the DevExpress site, which is the progress bar demo. And the progress bar demo gives an example of using a timer to count down a long function. And we want to see how TestCafe performs by just having a few actions in there. And I'm going to go through and explain how some of this works in just a second. But in essence, the test would switch the iframe. It's going to click on the progress button with the text start progress. It's going to do an assertion, which is looking for the expected text value of loading at 50%. And it's got a timeout value here of 10,000 milliseconds. And then finally, it wants to make sure that the progress button ends up with the text restart progress. Quite a simple test, but a very, very powerful one when it comes to showing you the wait mechanism. I'm going to run this up on the iPhone 10 just so that we've got some real estate, and run test. Browser is going to pop up. And this is quite a lengthy test. It takes maybe 19 seconds for the whole thing. But what we're going to see appear is the progress bar and the button to say start. The test is going to be executed, and we can see that that loading panel is going across. At that point, loading said 50%, but as you'll notice, only until that particular part of the progress was reached. Up until then, it said something else. Well, we know that the DOM itself didn't have loading 50% sitting in there, so we're talking about interacting with some real-time values. The test itself obviously passed. Looking at how it actually works then, all pages by nature are asynchronous. Many, many things are going to take different times to actually pop up. Elements on the page may appear with a delay. If we've got animation, that can affect things. We might have new data being pushed onto the page after it receives a response from a server or some other request. So TestCafe has got a built-in automatic weighting mechanism that doesn't require a dedicated API or for you to add any complicated code in there. It means that you don't have to think about any of the delays or timeouts, and you shouldn't be looking to add or constantly edit wait actions with some fancy magic number that may break completely dependent on what browser or what platform you're testing it on. Instead, you can just focus on writing the test, focus on writing the logic, and TestCafe is going to manage that test execution for you. I'm just going to spend a minute running through some of those different wait mechanisms. The first one we'll talk about is the mechanism for redirect. So you don't have to worry about a wait for page load or a wait for iframe content load event, because when your action triggers a redirect, TestCafe is going to automatically wait for the server to respond, and then the testing for that page will happen after it's completely loaded. Now the test will continue if the server hasn't responded within a default time of 15 seconds. We've then got the wait mechanism for actions. So before an action executes, TestCafe is going to automatically wait for the target element to first be present in the DOM and second become visible. It's going to try and evaluate the specified selector multiple times within that timeout period. And if the element doesn't appear, then eventually it's going to fail. TestCafe can even detect that the target element is moving or has been animated, and it will wait a little bit longer. In this case, it wants to make sure that the animation is finished. However, if it doesn't finish within the allotted time, then it's going to be the next action is going to be executed anyway. There's a wait mechanism for selectors. So if you're wanting to evaluate a selector to get an element or its property, TestCafe is going to execute this on the selector on the tested page. But it's going to automatically wait for the element to appear in the DOM. And it's going to keep trying to evaluate that selector until it does appear in the DOM or the timeout passes. You can also add an additional parameter that says not only should you wait for it to appear in the DOM, but you want to wait for it to actually become visible. And there's a visibility check selector option for this exact scenario. Now, if you're waiting or working with the XML HTTP request or XHR and fetch requests, then TestCafe is going to wait for that request to finish before it executes the test action. And it will then continue once the response is received or that timeout is exceeded. And the default timeout for this is 3 seconds. And then finally, we've got the wait mechanism for assertions. Now think about it. When you're wanting to do synchronous functional testing, you're going to execute your assertion immediately after your action. But in reality, for functional testing, we can't get the expected change immediately. Just because the user presses a button doesn't mean that everything's going to be available straight away. It could take time for that tested page to send the request, wait for the data to come back from the server, or for the user's action to evoke some animation, after which it reaches its final state. Now, there's no way that these intervals can be pre-calculated because they depend on various factors. It depends on the computer's performance. It depends on the network connection speed. So many different things. So we can't just perform the assertion immediately after the action. Otherwise, we're going to end up with inconclusive results. We certainly don't want to be messing around adding in things like wait events. Now, TestCafe uses a smart assertion query mechanism that if the assertion receives the selector's property or the client function promise as an actual value, and the assertion didn't pass, it's not going to fail the test automatically. Instead, it's going to retry the assertion a number of times. And each time it requests that actual value, it will do the assertion. Now, ultimately, if it keeps failing, then your test is going to fail. But what this approach allows is for you to create really stable tests with fast runtimes and reduces the risk of errors. Now, remember I pointed out before that all of these timeouts used for the waiting mechanisms, you can adjust in each of those scenarios. You can adjust them in the run configuration. You can increase and decrease the selector, the assertion, or the page loading timeouts. Let's take a look now then at some debugging and continuation of visual testing. What I'm going to do is open up a new test down here. And this time I want to look at an assertion test. Again, utilizing the example page as we've been doing. Now, I'm going to run this test just on its own. I'll switch back to Chrome and run. At this point, I've had a report from one of the test team to say that, hey, something's broken, was working, and now we're getting a red light on our integration tests. We can see here, submit button's pressed, the assertion's been tested, time's out, and the assertion failed. Typically, I could come into my log, I can have a look, it failed, I can drill down, and it's going to tell me why it failed, and there's a screenshot that it took as well. And at this point, I could say go to failed action. But there's a much nicer or easier way if I'm the one working or developing through this test. So not only will the recorder button allow me to go through and add new items to my test as I work through it, but I can also use it for debugging purposes. Here I'm going to say I want to record more test actions. Page is going to load. The assertion is testing now, and the assertion fails. Two things there. You might have noticed that in the background, TestCafe was showing me each of the steps as it was testing it. So it was running a blue line down through each of the actions, whether they're assertions or page actions. But here's what I'm interested in. It's actually automatically opened the assertion that failed. It's telling me the assertion error. It's saying that it expected thank you, Peter, but in actual fact, it expected the thank you, Peter, to match what we wanted, which was thank you, Parker. The CSS selector is pointing to article header. I'm looking for the text content property, and here we can clearly see the value. Well, if I look back through my test, I could come up here and see that in actual fact, I'm adding the name Peter. So in actual fact, it's a bug in my test. But to make life easier, I can come through and I can use the target element picker. I can click, and it's going to bring up the page that the assertion was on. And you can see that as I move through any of these elements on here, I'm being shown the selector. And at this point, I want that one. Back into TestCafe Studio, and it's saying, okay, the verified property text content, the actual value is thank you, Peter. Well, in hindsight, that's the value I actually want. And all I would need to do is click on this little button here, and it's now set to thank you, Peter. I could resume my test. I can, in this case, stop recording. I'm just going to run that test again, and this time look for a green light as it runs through. So it's quite powerful to use the recorder there as a visual debugger. We've already talked about the fact that I could put the page into debug mode from my run configuration. I can use manual debug elements within my tests, and now I've got the option of using the recorder as well. We've talked about the unlocking of a page and stepping through in the browser. Other things that we can do when we work through that visual recorder is invoke the record configuration dialog, and we can see that we've got those playback settings. So again, yet another place where when I'm doing my recording, I can override the default timeout selector, select that timeout. I can alter the speed of the playback during recording. I can alter the assertion timeout, and I can force it into debug mode. This is, we're talking back through that visual recording element where it's going to play back existing tests first. So that's a little different to just our straight run or test configuration. Now let's talk about selector prioritization and how to get a stable selector. I've just got a simple file here to look through some scenarios, because TestCafe Studio has an algorithm that will pick up the selectors that are more practical for what you're working through on a page. And it adheres to a number of requirements. So I guess this next section is a little bit more of a do and don't and how to get the most out of your selectors. Let's start with the fact that selectors shouldn't be too specific. Otherwise, you're going to have to rewrite them after every page change. So in this instance, we're saying the selector starts with the body, is going to find the 5th div, and then find the 3rd paragraph on that. Well, that's just crazy in a sense that at any point the code could change on the page, the marker could change, and that test no longer works. Not only that, but it's also difficult to read. There's nothing there that's telling me what element it's really pointing to. Next, we consider that selectors shouldn't be too generic. Otherwise, you're going to get different elements after each markup change. So with an example of find a button could match multiple elements at once. Not very useful. You shouldn't rely on parameters that are likely to change. And in this example, we're talking about looking at a CSS color. Given the fact that more and more applications and sites offer the fact that users can change themes and do other things, trying to create a selector based on a style is fraught with danger. Selectors should remain readable. They should be easy to understand by you, another developer, or a non-developer that might be working in the testing team. And that needs to be the case for as long as the test is going to be maintained. It may be difficult to understand why or which element corresponds to the selector like so. Again, there's not a lot there describing what should be happening. Whereas if we look at the next line down, we're going to say, find the top container, find a child with the text add item. It makes it much easier to read. And then selectors should be reflecting the user's point of view. And remembering that we're talking about it being an end-to-end testing, so it's a good idea to build selectors that identify as an actual end user would. For instance, find name button foo123 tends to be something a developer would look for rather than something that the user would from their perspective. The other thing to consider is the organization of pages. In addition to general requirements that we've talked about, page organization is critical. You might have some pages that have stable selectors that rely on things like the ID attribute, while other pages use auto-generated IDs. So it makes no sense to be using them. In particular, if you're using a framework that starts to move things like class names out of the way. So let's say React elements with their CSS in JS approach. And sometimes text-based selectors can be really ineffective depending on what you introduce. And in particular, think about things like localization. There's no point looking for a button that says OK if you support multiple languages. That's when you should think about looking at using custom attributes. Now, custom attributes remove the limitations, and many developers prefer to assign a custom attribute to specific page elements. We've got an example of one down here that I could build a selector based on a custom attribute called data test ID. Therefore, I can easily identify any element on my page that is a testable element, and I can give it a meaningful name so that it's easy to read and understand. There's some key benefits of doing it this way. Your tests aren't going to break based on any markup or code changes. A test isn't going to fail when you refactor your HTML or implement new behavior in JavaScript. Your tests aren't going to be dependent on styles or page styles. You can switch your theme as many times as you want and you're not going to run into that problem. And of course, text content modifications aren't going to break anything. So if you are looking at localization or even just the spelling of something changes, it's not going to break your test. TestCafe Studio has a prioritization engine method built in. What we can do again is just bring up our record browser configuration. And here we've got the Selector generation prioritization grid. We can see at the moment the order goes from ID all the way down to a position on the DOM. I can simply drag anything I want, any which way I want, and that is the way or the order that the selectors will be generated when I get to choose them inside TestCafe. If there's something that I'm not using, so it could be that tag name is pointless to me, I can simply turn that off and it will be ignored from that selection. As I mentioned about custom attributes, I can simply add a custom attribute, type in what attribute name that I'm going to use, and then it now becomes the highest priority in that selector generation. And it's always handy to get rid of types that you're not going to be using. So I'm not using class, then I want to turn class off. Now what's really important to note at this point is that functionality you can do in real time. You can be in the middle of recording a test, switch to the record configuration dialog, make changes, and then continue with your testing, and TestCafe will honor those new options that you've set. So quite a powerful way to interact with your selectors. One of the things that the team asked me to present to you all is a bit of a sneak preview. And I feel, I suppose, a little bit cheeky with the fact that I get to do this. So what I'm going to do is actually switch into, I'll close some of these tests down and just reset some of these for safety. And then I'm going to switch over to show you a feature. One thing I want you to remember with what we're about to step through is this feature is going to be released in the next major version release. Now before everybody starts spamming the question box and asking when's that going to be, I've been told I'm not allowed to say any terms and dates. Julian will grumble at me as he does, but it is definitely something that I think is a game changer. And that is Recorder in Code. As we've seen from our earlier examples, we can use TestCafe Studio's interface to actually work with a JavaScript version of a test. So if I was to take the test I recorded earlier, convert that to JavaScript, there's all the conversion, and I can then tweak that, work with it, do whatever else I need to. And there's a lot of benefits around using a code or using the code rather than the visual tester, especially in complex scenarios. What's nice is we can get from visual to code, but the exciting thing that I want to share today is the recorder in code. So some of those really cool features that we've been looking at, the benefits of doing visual recording, are now being brought into that code element. Here we can see that I've got my straightforward test. I've got simply imported the selector library or class from the TestCafe library. I've set up my fixture, and now I'm starting my test. All I need to do is click on the recorder button. We're going to see the familiar page load. I'm going to resize the browser slightly. Actually, I won't yet. The first thing we'll notice from a visual aspect different to the normal visual recorder is that we've got a couple of new panels. We've got a pause button as well over here. So right now I'm working in the action recording panel, and it says perform an action on the page. I'm going to do my click, commit my click, type my name again. It's always good when I get to spell it right. Commit that, click a couple of buttons, And what we're going to see if I switch back to my editor window is the fact that in real time, the code is being generated back into my test. So I get the benefit of a visual recorder with the fact that I'm writing more complex tests, or I even just prefer to work in a JavaScript or TypeScript test file. Now, if I was presenting this on stage, I certainly would be pausing on behalf of the team and getting that round of applause, because I think it's a phenomenal feature that is coming to the next major version. And with that, there's some other little things I want to point out. Obviously, everything that I'm working on there is being recorded. But if I switch back to my page, one of the things that I can do is use the Selector menu up here. And I'm going to come back and stay in Linux. You can see all of the elements that have a selector from main form with label are now being highlighted on screen. If I come through and I type Mac OS, we can see that just the one element that I want is being highlighted. And that one element, or the last element, is also being edited in real time inside the TestCafe Studio editor. Just as I showed before, I could actually jump in and maintain my selector generation prioritization in real time. I'd simply make the changes, save those changes, and switch back to my tests, and those changes would be implemented immediately. I can use the drop down to see what selectors have been picked for this particular test. Now, it could be that you're, again, still preferring to write your test manually, and the visual thing is cool, but you really just want to use it to work on selectors and work out what selectors are available. All we can do here is switch to what we call the selector playground. Again, here's our page, but as I mouse over all the different elements, you can see that it's giving me the selector. Again, that's based on that prioritization functionality that I showed previously. If I click on developer name, it's going to come up into this box and show me developer name. I've still got the ability of looking at the other selectors that have been generated around that. And I don't know whether you noticed, but just if I click, just look over to this copy button when I go back to my developer name. Immediately, it will copy that selector into clipboard, which means that if I was coming down here and was manually writing a click event, that I can paste that straight in. I've got the ability to actually go back and force the clipboard if I wanted to, so I can manually copy it again. Or in fact, I can use the inject button, and if we look back, it's now injected that into the editor as well. So I think that there's some phenomenal functionality that's coming through with that recorder. You'll also be able to do the resume the same as you could with the other mode, and so you'll be able to pick up some tests and continue to work through them. So certainly a big feature that I think is worthwhile looking forward to in the future versions. And with that, what I might do is ask Julian to jump on and help me with some questions.
Sure thing. Let me have a quick look and see what's being asked.
Oh, good morning, Julian.
Good morning. Yes. Good morning, everyone. Yes. I'm in the background. Okay, let me just open up a little bit here, and let's see how the team is doing really well. I must admit, it's been good. So let me see if I can find something that's.
I'll throw one up here. Am I allowed to install Studio on a customer's site for tests in their environment? And the answer to that is TestCafe Studio is installed on a local computer. It's not hosted on a site. So you install it on a Linux machine, a Mac machine, or a Windows machine, and you can then configure it to run any website that you want to test. So it's licensed at that level. Can Studio artificially slow down the test run for better viewing? And that's one of the things that I was showing throughout there. You can manually change the entire execution of the test, or you can actually add in a speed action throughout the test and change the test itself at many different places.
Here's an interesting one. Is it possible to check a text assertion with wildcards in it to check for multiple possible text values? And the answer is yes. You can use regular expressions for that kind of purpose.
Can TestCafe Studio, or can I, we were actually talking about this earlier, Julian. Somebody asked the question, can I perform Windows form tests using TestCafe Studio? And the answer is no. It is for testing website, web applications, and even web services to some extent, but web-based testing only.
In essence, HTML. So if you've got some HTML, then we can test it through a browser, essentially.
Works with Blazor.
And works with Blazor, and works with ASP.NET, and all the rest of those good things.
How do you use the GUI to create custom attribute for a web page? With this, you can customize the selector generation mechanism. A lot of the examples, and if people want to go back through and look at the last presentation that we did, we put some links up to the TestCafe documentation page, where not only is the usage functionality documented, but the team provides some great recipes and instructions on different scenarios on how to do so many different things.
One which is a more general kind of question is, will you include a copy of the Q&A for the webinar along with the YouTube video? And the answer is yes. We generally do a blog post, and what we do there is to list all the questions and all the definitive answers, shall we say. So look out for that in the fairly near future as we do a little bit of editing and proofing and all the rest of it.
Are there any problems in testing SPA type applications, specifically Angular? So single page applications like Angular, we are more than happy to test. There's no problems whatsoever. And you can also use a plugin to test applications, Angular applications, even easier. And there will be a link to that on said blog post pointing to TestCafe Angular selectors. There are actually quite a lot of questions as usual, Julian.
There are. It's going to be a good blog post. There you go.
And I guess that I get to handle that again. So honoring the clock as we do. I don't think there's anything coming in late there.
Yeah.
Maybe we invite Amanda back to... Oh, there's Julian's dulcet tones.
Yeah. My clock is chiming.
Oh, sweet sounds of the clock. People are waiting for the sounds of your clock, Julian. In the questions box.
I'm sorry.
It wouldn't be a webinar without Julian's clock.
Nope. All right, everybody. Like I mentioned before, today's webinar will be available later on our DevExpress YouTube channel, and you will receive an email, a follow-up email with a link to the webinar and a link to that blog post with the Q&A. And that is it for this one. Thank you so much to Paul. Thank you all for joining us. And of course, thank you for choosing DevExpress. Bye-bye.